Hello, and welcome to the Sleepy Curiosity channel. As you settle into a comfortable position, let your body begin to release the weight of the day. If this gentle journey is already starting to slow your thoughts, consider subscribing now, so these stories can keep finding you night after night. Now, let the relaxation settle into your breath. You are carrying a universe inside you right now. Not a metaphor, a literal statement. The atoms that make up your body were forged inside stars that exploded billions of years before you existed. And yet, here they are, arranged with such extraordinary precision that they can think, feel, and wonder about their own existence. And the more we look, the more remarkable that becomes. The human body seems solid. You can feel the weight of the mattress beneath you right now, the gentle pressure of every surface touching your skin. It feels dense, concrete, real. But if it were possible to look at your body on an atomic scale, if you could shrink down to the size of an electron and travel through the space between your own cells, you would find something completely unexpected. Almost nothing. The atoms that make up every inch of your body are, in their vast majority, empty space. The nucleus of each atom is so small relative to the size of the whole atom that, proportionally, it would be like placing a pea at the center of a football stadium. And what exists between the nucleus and the electrons orbiting around it? Practically nothing but invisible forces. If it were possible to remove all that space from the atoms in your body, the remaining mass of your entire physical structure would fit into an object smaller than a grain of rice. What we feel as solidity isn't dense matter. It's the electromagnetic repulsion between particles, forces that refuse to overlap, creating the convincing illusion of surface, of weight, of physical presence. Your body is an illusion built by physics. And it is extraordinarily effective. And there's one detail that changes everything when you start to understand where those atoms came from. The oxygen filling your lungs right now was not made on Earth. The carbon that forms the structure of every protein in your body didn't originate here. The iron circulating in your blood, that same iron that gives blood its color, can only be created inside stars with enough mass to generate the temperatures needed for nuclear fusion. And when those stars reach the end of their lives, they explode in events called supernovas, scattering their elements through space at unimaginable speeds. Billions of years later, gravity gathered those scattered elements. It formed clouds, then planets, then oceans, then molecules that learned to copy themselves, and then life. And then you. The body you inhabit isn't just the result of biological evolution. It's the result of 13.8 billion years of cosmic history, converging at this exact point. You didn't come from stardust in a poetic sense, you are, literally and verifiably, stellar matter that developed the ability to contemplate itself. There's something that almost no one notices when they think about their own body. You're not alone in it. and not in a metaphorical sense. In purely numerical terms, your body is inhabited by a quantity of bacterial cells that rivals the number of cells you consider yours. For a long time, it was believed there were 10 bacteria for every human cell. Science has revised that number, but the reality remains unsettling. Recent studies suggest a ratio close to 1:1. For every human cell in your body, there is approximately 1 bacterial cell. The greatest concentration lives in your large intestine, in an ecosystem of trillions of organisms that evolved alongside humans for millions of years. These bacteria are not invaders. They are not just passing through. They help digest foods that your own enzymes can't process, produce vitamins your body wouldn't know how to make on its own, and carry on a continuous conversation with your immune system. The question of exactly where you begin and end is, biologically, far more complicated than it seems. Now imagine a line. A line so thin it would be invisible to any conventional measuring instrument, yet so long that if stretched out it would cross the solar system 200 times. That line exists. And it's inside you. Every cell in your body, and you have about 37 trillion of them, contains approximately 6 feet of DNA compacted into a nucleus less than 1/100th of a millimeter in diameter. If you added up all that DNA and stretched it in a straight line, the total length would exceed 70 billion kilometers. From the Earth to the Sun and back more than 200 times. This compaction is made possible by specialized proteins that function like microscopic spools. The DNA winds around them in successive layers of organization, reducing a meter of genetic material to the size of an almost invisible dot. And despite this extreme compression, the organism can find, read, and use specific sections of that sequence with a precision that has no parallel in any human technology. This starts to get more interesting when you consider that errors happen constantly. Every cell sustains between 10,000 and 100,000 injuries to its DNA every single day, caused by radiation, by free radicals, by copying mistakes. And the body has entire systems dedicated to locating and correcting that damage before it becomes permanent. A molecular repair crew working non-stop, invisibly, inside each one of your cells, right now. What seems simple, isn't. The skeleton. Everyone knows what a skeleton is, the rigid structure that supports the body, that stays static once a person stops growing. That's how we tend to think of it. But that picture is wrong in a way that changes everything. Bone is living tissue. It has blood vessels. It has working cells. Two distinct cell populations are right now, as you rest, carrying out a continuous dance of destruction and construction inside your bones. Osteoclasts dissolve portions of old bone. Osteoblasts build new tissue in its place. This cycle happens without stopping, throughout the entire skeleton, across an entire lifetime. In young adults, the complete skeleton is renewed in about 10 years. The femur you have today is not the same femur you had 10 years ago. It's a structure built cell by cell over that decade. And beyond supporting the body's weight, bones produce blood cells in the marrow, store essential minerals, and function as active metabolic reservoirs that respond to hormonal signals. A newborn has around 270 bones. An adult has 206. The difference wasn't lost, it was fused. Small bones that existed separately in childhood progressively joined together during growth, creating larger and more stable structures. And there's one detail that changes everything when it comes to skin. Skin is often overlooked in the big conversations about the body. The heart gets attention. The brain fascinates. But the skin, the largest organ in the human body, with a surface area of about 15 to 20 square feet and a weight of roughly 9 pounds, is rarely treated with the same interest. That's a considerable oversight. The outermost layer of the skin, the epidermis, renews itself completely every 2 to 4 weeks. The cells that form the surface you can touch right now didn't exist a month ago. They were produced in the deeper layers, gradually made their way to the surface, and will be shed in the coming days. It's estimated that a person loses between 1 and 2 grams of skin cells per hour, which means that over the course of a year, you completely swap out your surface several times over. Beneath that layer of constant renewal lies a dense architecture, hair follicles, glands that regulate temperature, nerve endings that detect pressure, vibration, temperature, and pain with extraordinary resolution, and vessels that control blood flow to regulate body heat. And on the surface of this complex organ, an entire ecosystem of microorganisms, hundreds of different species, lives in stable balance, playing a part in the body's defense system. The blood seems simple. A red liquid. But that barely begins to describe what it really is. From a biological standpoint, blood is classified as a tissue, a liquid connective tissue with distinct components and complementary functions. The plasma, the liquid portion that makes up about 55% of the total volume, carries hormones, nutrients, proteins, and the waste products of metabolism. Red blood cells carry oxygen thanks to a protein called hemoglobin, and it's the iron in that protein that gives blood the color we associate with it. And the platelets. Those small structures that circulate silently and that, the moment a vessel is damaged, initiate a signaling cascade that results in the formation of a clot, a repair process that begins within seconds and involves dozens of proteins working in precise sequence. The adult body contains between 4.5 and 5.5 liters of blood. And red blood cells are renewed at a rate of approximately 2 million per second. 2 million per second. As you drift toward sleep, that process continues, uninterrupted, as it has every second since before you were born. What almost no one realizes is that the body has a second circulatory system running in parallel with the blood. The lymphatic system is just as extensive as the circulatory system, a network of vessels that runs through virtually every tissue in the body, but it works in a completely different way. It has no central pump. Lymph moves primarily through the pressure generated by the contraction of muscles surrounding the vessels and by the rhythm of breathing. It's a system that depends on the body's movement to circulate. Its primary function is to collect the excess fluid that leaks from blood capillaries into the tissues and return it to circulation. But along the way, that fluid passes through structures called lymph nodes, small filtration stations distributed strategically throughout the body, where immune cells inspect what has passed through the tissues, looking for signs of infection or damage. When a lymph node swells during an illness, it's not a failure. It's a sign that that inspection point is actively processing a threat, that the system is working. This shouldn't work the way it does, but it does. The liver carries out more than 500 identified functions. 500! No other organ in the human body has a remotely comparable list of responsibilities. It produces bile for fat digestion, synthesizes essential proteins for blood clotting, regulates glucose levels, metabolizes medications and chemical substances, stores vitamins and minerals, produces immune factors, and performs hundreds of other biochemical reactions simultaneously. But what makes the liver truly singular among internal organs is something that goes beyond its functions. It can regenerate. If up to 70% of the organ is surgically removed, in a resection to treat a tumor, for example, the liver can recover its original volume within a matter of weeks. This process is controlled by precise molecular signals that activate the division of remaining liver cells until the appropriate size is restored. And then they stop. The liver knows when it's done growing. How that mechanism knows exactly when to halt regeneration is a question biology hasn't completely answered yet. As you rest, your heart has already beaten dozens of times since you started listening to these words. The adult heart beats an average of 60 to 100 times per minute at rest. That adds up to about 100,000 beats per day. In a year, more than 36 million. Over a lifetime of 70 years, more than 2.5 billion beats, and not one of them depends on a conscious decision from you. Each beat is a coordinated contraction of 4 chambers, orchestrated by electrical impulses generated by the heart itself. The sinoatrial node, a small structure in the right atrium, functions as the natural pacemaker, firing rhythmic signals that propagate through the cardiac muscle in a precise sequence, ensuring the chambers contract in the right order to move blood efficiently. Between each beat, there's a brief moment of relaxation, the diastole, during which the heart muscle receives its own blood supply through the coronary arteries. The heart nourishes itself during the interval between contractions. A pause that is also a refueling. And there's one detail about the heart that almost no one considers: it would keep beating even outside the body, as long as it received adequate oxygen and nutrients. That functional autonomy from the central nervous system is more complete than in any other structure in the organism. The stomach produces an acid with a pH between 1.5 and 3.5. For reference, vinegar has a pH of around 3. Gastric juice is comparable to concentrated hydrochloric acid, capable of dissolving certain metals, breaking down tissue, destroying the majority of microorganisms that enter through the mouth before they ever reach the intestine. And the stomach doesn't dissolve itself because a layer of mucus about 0.5 millimeter thick, continuously secreted by the cells of the stomach wall itself, neutralizes the acid before it comes into contact with the tissue. This barrier renews itself completely every 2 weeks. It's one of the most elegant protections in the organism. The organ that produces the acid also produces, in a coordinated way, the shield that keeps it from being destroyed by the very acid it creates. When that protection fails, through infection by a bacterium called Helicobacter pylori, which can survive in the acidic environment and take up residence in the stomach wall, or through prolonged use of certain anti-inflammatory drugs, the balance breaks down. The acid begins to attack the wall. The result is an ulcer, a wound in the stomach itself, caused by the chemistry that was supposed to stay contained. This starts to get more interesting when you consider what happens after the stomach. The small intestine measures between 6 and 7 meters in length. But the length doesn't describe its true extent, because the inner surface is folded in on itself at 3 different levels, circular folds, which are in turn covered by projections called villi, and each villus is covered by even smaller structures called microvilli. This system of folds within folds expands the absorption surface to somewhere between 250 and 300 square meters. 300 square meters inside a 7-meter tube. It's the difference between a crumpled sheet of paper and that same sheet laid completely flat, applied to the interior of an organ. That enormous surface ensures that amino acids, glucose, fatty acids, vitamins, and minerals are efficiently absorbed as food passes through. Different regions of the small intestine are specialized in absorbing specific types of nutrients. Each segment has a particular function within a process that is, taken as a whole, extraordinarily precise. And while all of that is happening in the intestine, the kidneys are doing something that only starts to seem reasonable when you see the number. The 2 kidneys filter about 180 liters of fluid per day. The entire volume of blood in the body is filtered more than 400 times in 24 hours. From the vast majority of that enormous volume, the organism reabsorbs what's useful: water, electrolytes, glucose, amino acids, and discards only 1 to 2 liters in the form of urine. Each kidney contains approximately 1 million filtration units called nephrons. Each nephron is a miniature structure that filters the blood, selectively reabsorbs what's needed, and produces the fluid that will eventually become urine. It's a process of extraordinary precision happening on an industrial scale, 1 million nephrons per kidney, working in parallel, continuously. Beyond filtering, the kidneys regulate electrolyte levels, control blood pH, and produce hormones. One stimulates the production of red blood cells in the bone marrow. Another regulates blood pressure. That's why chronic kidney problems affect so many systems simultaneously. The kidneys aren't just filters. They're wide-reaching regulators. What seems simple isn't. There is a nervous system you never consciously control, and it governs far more than you might imagine. The autonomic nervous system manages breathing, digestion, heart rate, blood pressure, pupil dilation, blood flow to the organs, dozens of vital processes, without any instruction from you. It operates in parallel with the voluntary nervous system in an almost completely independent way. And it divides into two branches that function like opposing voices in a constant dialogue. The sympathetic system is the voice of alertness. It speeds up the heart, dilates the bronchi, redirects blood to the muscles, temporarily suspends digestion. It's the system that prepares the body to act. The parasympathetic is the voice of rest. It slows the heart, stimulates digestion, promotes recovery. These two systems are permanently active and balance each other second by second as demands shift. And what's less intuitive is that this balance can be consciously influenced. The slow, deep breathing you may be doing right now activates the parasympathetic system in a measurable way, reducing heart rate and cortisol levels in the blood. The body listens to what you do with your breath. And there's one detail that changes everything about how the body communicates internally. The vagus nerve is the longest nerve in the autonomic nervous system. It starts at the brainstem, travels down through the neck, crosses the chest, and branches through the abdomen, innervating the heart, the lungs, the esophagus, the stomach, the intestine, and the liver. Its name in Latin means wandering, a reference to its extensive, branching path through virtually the entire body. And here's what's surprising, about 80% of the vagus nerve's fibers are afferent. They transmit information from the organs to the brain, not the other way around. The body is constantly sending data to the brain about its internal state. The intestine reports. The heart reports. The lungs report. And the brain uses that information to regulate mood, attention, stress responses, and behavior. What you feel isn't just a decision the brain makes about how to interpret the world. It's also the result of a continuous conversation between the brain and the organs, a two-way dialogue in which the body influences the mind just as much as the mind influences the body. Pain seems to be a property of damaged tissue. It seems to be in the injured knee, in the burn, in the aching head. but neurologically, pain is an experience created by the brain. Nociceptors, receptors distributed throughout the tissues that detect potentially harmful stimuli, send signals to the central nervous system. But the brain then decides, based on multiple factors, context, emotional state, attention, memory, expectation, whether to generate the experience of pain and at what intensity. This explains why the same injury can be perceived in completely different ways depending on the situation. Soldiers wounded in combat frequently report feeling no pain at the moment of injury. The brain, assessing that acting is more urgent than feeling, temporarily suppresses the painful experience. And it explains phantom limb pain, in which people who have lost a limb continue to feel pain in it, because the pain wasn't in the limb. It was in the brain. The placebo effect operates through this same mechanism. The expectation of relief activates neural circuits that genuinely reduce the experience of pain, with no active substance involved. The brain produces the relief it believes it's receiving. This starts to get more interesting when you consider what the brain does with imagination. When a person imagines performing a physical movement in detail, the same motor regions of the brain that would be activated during the actual movement become active. Imagining playing the piano activates the motor cortex in a way similar to actually playing. Athletes who practice mental visualization of movements, without moving at all, without any additional physical training, show measurable improvements in performance. The brain uses imagination as simulation. And that simulation has real effects on the body. Mentally reliving a stressful experience activates physiological responses, increased cortisol, accelerated heart rate, as if the event were happening right now. Anticipating something with fear prepares the body to react to a threat that hasn't arrived yet. The boundary between what is real and what is imagined is, for the nervous system, far thinner than everyday experience suggests. And the brain never stops. Not even now. One of the most common assumptions about sleep is that the brain rests during the night. From a metabolic standpoint, that's not quite accurate. The brain's consumption of glucose and oxygen during sleep is only slightly lower than when awake. During certain phases, especially REM sleep, brain activity is just as intense as during moments of active concentration. What changes during sleep isn't the amount of activity, but the type. A system called the glymphatic system, identified in detail only in 2013, becomes significantly more active during deep sleep. It functions like a drainage network around the brain's blood vessels, removing metabolic waste that has accumulated throughout the day. Among the compounds eliminated by this system are proteins whose buildup is associated with Alzheimer's disease. During sleep, the space between brain cells increases by up to 60%, allowing cerebrospinal fluid to circulate more freely and flush out that waste. Sleep is not a period of inactivity. It's an active process of cleaning and maintenance that the brain can't carry out efficiently while it's busy processing the world. Sleep is organized into cycles of approximately 90 minutes, each made up of phases with completely distinct functions. The deep sleep phases, when brain activity slows, when breathing and heart rate reach their lowest values, are when most of the physical restoration occurs. Growth hormone is released primarily during deep sleep. Tissues repair themselves. The immune system strengthens its memories. It's the moment of rebuilding. REM sleep, in which the eyes move rapidly beneath closed eyelids and the brain enters a state of intense activity, is when most dreaming occurs. But beyond the dreams, this phase plays a critical role in consolidating memories, processing emotional experiences, and creating connections between pieces of information that during the day seemed unrelated. Depriving a person specifically of REM sleep, waking them every time they enter that phase, even while maintaining total sleep time, causes cognitive and emotional deterioration. The phases aren't interchangeable. Each one does what the other cannot. And there's something that almost no one considers when they think about hunger. The feeling of hunger seems to come from the stomach. The stomach growls, and you feel hungry. But the actual mechanism involves hormones that travel through the bloodstream and act directly on the brain. The primary hunger hormone is ghrelin, produced by the stomach when it's empty. It acts on the hypothalamus, the brain region that regulates appetite, temperature, and metabolism, generating the impulse to eat. On the other side, fat tissue produces a hormone called leptin that signals long-term satiety to the brain, reporting on available energy stores. In people with obesity, the brain can develop leptin resistance, a state in which the satiety signal exists, circulates in the blood at elevated levels, but isn't adequately processed. The body sends the message. The receptor doesn't hear it. And the feeling of hunger persists regardless of available energy stores. Hunger isn't simply a mechanical response to an empty stomach. It's the result of a complex hormonal network that integrates information about the present and the long term, and that network can be disrupted in ways that willpower alone cannot correct. Chronic stress does something to the brain that isn't metaphorical. Cortisol, the primary stress hormone, is released by the adrenal glands in response to perceived threats. In acute situations, it's essential. It raises blood sugar, sharpens attention, prepares the body to react. But when cortisol levels remain elevated for weeks and months, as happens with chronic stress, the effects become destructive. Prolonged exposure to cortisol reduces the volume of the hippocampus, the brain region central to memory and learning. It weakens connections in the prefrontal cortex, impairing planning and emotional control. And at the same time, it strengthens connections in the amygdala, the region associated with fear and threat, making the brain more reactive, more vigilant, harder to calm. These changes are visible in neuroimaging scans. They are not just functional, they are structural. Chronic stress literally reshapes the brain's architecture, making it easier to feel fear and harder to think clearly. What's equally important is that the process can be reversed, at least partially. Exercise, adequate sleep, and practices that activate the parasympathetic system, like the deep breathing you may be doing right now, have measurable structural effects on those very same regions. And this is where things get strange. You are emitting light right now. All living organisms emit an extremely small number of photons as a byproduct of metabolic reactions, a phenomenon called ultraweak bioluminescence. In humans, this emission is real and measurable with sensitive equipment, but it's about 1,000 times weaker than the threshold of human vision. Invisible without instrumentation. Studies conducted with ultra-high sensitivity cameras have shown that the human body emits more light from the face than from other regions, and that the intensity varies throughout the day, peaking in the early afternoon. This variation appears to be related to the circadian rhythm and metabolic activity. The emission has no known biological function. It's a byproduct of cellular oxidation reactions. But the fact that your body literally emits light, imperceptible, continuous, present as you breathe, is one of those details that slightly changes the way you see what it means to be alive. The human brain contains approximately 86 billion neurons. For decades, the repeated number was 100 billion, but a researcher named Susanna Herculano-Hausel developed a more precise counting method and arrived at 86 billion. But the number of neurons, by itself, explains almost nothing about what the brain can do. What defines the brain's capacity is the number of connections between neurons. Each neuron can form between 1,000 and 10,000 synapses with other neurons. The total number of connections in the human brain is estimated at something close to 100 trillion. 100 trillion connections. The number of possible activation configurations in that network exceeds the number of atoms in the observable universe. And this 3-pound organ consumes 20% of the body's total energy at rest, despite making up only 2% of total body mass. It has no pain receptors. It doesn't store glucose locally. It depends on a continuous supply of oxygen. An interruption of just 4 to 6 minutes already causes irreversible damage. For such a central organ, it is surprisingly vulnerable. And there's one detail about synapses that completely changes the image of the brain as an electrical network. Most synapses in the central nervous system are not direct physical connections. The two neurons don't touch. Between them exists a gap, the synaptic cleft, about 20 to 40 nanometers wide, and the signal doesn't cross that gap the way electricity crosses a wire. When an electrical impulse reaches the terminal of a neuron, it triggers the release of molecules called neurotransmitters, which cross the cleft by diffusion and bind to specific receptors on the next neuron. Depending on the type of receptor, they generate a new electrical impulse or inhibit one. That entire process, from electrical to chemical and back to electrical, happens in less than 1 millisecond. And the brain carries out this cycle across trillions of synapses simultaneously, all the time. Substances like antidepressants, anesthetics, and psychoactive drugs act at exactly this point, interfering with that chemical dance happening in the space between neurons. This starts to get more interesting when you think about the intestine. The gastrointestinal tract has its own nervous system. Not an extension of the central nervous system, an independent system, with between 100 and 500 million neurons distributed throughout the walls of the esophagus, stomach, small intestine, and large intestine. That number exceeds the total number of neurons in the spinal cord and all the peripheral nerves in the body. It's often called the second brain. This system can coordinate movements, regulate secretions, and control local blood flow in a completely autonomous way, without needing instructions from the brain in your head. If the vagus nerve is cut, the intestine keeps working. The communication between the two systems, however, is intense and bidirectional. And recent research indicates that signals coming from the intestine influence mood, behavior, and cognitive processes. The field of the gut-brain axis is being mapped with increasing intensity, and what's being found suggests that the boundary between digestion and emotion is far less clear than previously thought. The pancreas is an organ with a dual functional identity that rarely gets the attention it deserves. As an exocrine gland, it produces digestive enzymes that are released into the small intestine to process carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Without these enzymes, digestion would be severely compromised. As an endocrine gland, it produces hormones that are released directly into the bloodstream. The best known are insulin and glucagon, two hormones that work in opposition to keep blood glucose levels within a narrow and precise range. Insulin lowers glucose by facilitating its entry into cells. Glucagon raises glucose by stimulating the liver to release its reserves. That balance is continuously adjusted throughout the day, responding to every meal, every period of fasting, every situation of stress or physical activity. It's a real-time regulation, invisible, of one of the most critical variables for the functioning of practically every cell in the body. And the lungs do something that seems obvious but isn't. They don't pull air in. They are inflated. The lungs have no muscle of their own. They're passive structures that expand or contract as the pressure around them changes. The work is done by the diaphragm, a dome-shaped muscle that, when it contracts, moves downward and increases the volume of the chest cavity. This reduces the internal pressure. Air comes in simply because the pressure outside is greater than the pressure inside. Internally, The lungs are made up of about 300 million alveoli, tiny air sacs with ultra-thin, richly vascularized walls. The total surface area of these alveoli is approximately 750 square feet. It's across this surface that oxygen crosses into the blood and carbon dioxide makes the return journey, a process called gas exchange that happens in fractions of a second, with every breath, across an entire lifetime. What almost no one considers is the speed of cellular renewal. The human body produces and destroys about 3,800,000 cells per second. Red blood cells last about 120 days. Cells lining the intestine live only 3 to 5 days. Platelets have a lifespan of 7 to 10 days. Some neurons remain active for an entire lifetime. The process of programmed cell destruction has a name: apoptosis. An orderly cell death, without inflammation, in which the cell methodically dismantles itself and its components are recycled. It's estimated that between 50 and 70 billion cells die by apoptosis every single day in an adult. This process isn't a failure. It's essential for development, for tissue maintenance, and for tumor prevention. When apoptosis fails, when damaged cells keep dividing instead of dismantling themselves, the result can be cancer. Programmed cell death is, in a certain sense, one of the most fundamental protections life has. And there's something that changes everything about body temperature. The 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit commonly cited as normal body temperature is an average, not a fixed value. Core body temperature oscillates about 1 degree over 24 hours, following the circadian rhythm. It's lower in the early hours of the morning, around 4 a.m., and reaches its peak in the late afternoon. This variation is coordinated with the sleep-wake cycle and with melatonin production. The drop in temperature in the hours leading up to sleep is, in fact, one of the signals the body uses to induce drowsiness. The reduction in core temperature helps ease the transition into sleep. That's why very warm environments make it hard to fall asleep. And it's why hot baths before bed paradoxically help, not because the heat relaxes the muscles, though that happens too, but because the vasodilation they produce accelerates heat loss from the body shortly afterward, helping core temperature drop. The body is doing that right now. Cooling subtly. Preparing the transition. Physical exercise does something to the brain that goes far beyond cardiovascular effects. Regular aerobic activity stimulates the production of a protein called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which promotes the growth and survival of neurons and strengthens synaptic connections. It's often described as fertilizer for the brain, a description that, despite being simplified, captures something real. Studies show that regular aerobic exercise increases the volume of the hippocampus, improves memory and learning, reduces symptoms of depression and anxiety with effectiveness comparable to antidepressants in some contexts, and slows the cognitive decline associated with aging. These effects are visible in neuroimaging scans. They are structural, not just functional. Exercise, in that sense, may be the most broadly effective and accessible intervention for brain health available. It requires no prescription, has no documented side effects at typical doses, and the benefits accumulate over time. A body that moves literally builds a different brain than a body that stays still. The sense of smell is the only sense with a direct connection to the brain regions linked to memory and emotion. All other senses pass through a structure called the thalamus before reaching the cerebral cortex for conscious processing. Smell doesn't. Olfactory signals arrive directly at the olfactory bulb, which has direct connections to the amygdala and the hippocampus, the central structures of emotional processing and memory. That's why smells have an extraordinary ability to evoke old memories with unusual emotional intensity. A smell can retrieve a memory from decades past with a vividness that images and sounds can rarely match. The feeling of being transported to another time and place by an unexpected scent isn't sentimentality, it's neuroanatomy. From an evolutionary standpoint, it makes sense. For our ancestors, the quick and emotional detection of odors, of food, of predator, of threat, was critical for survival. And the system that evolved for that purpose created, as a byproduct, the most direct connection that exists between the outside world and emotional memory. And there's something in the immune system that seems impossible until you understand the mechanism. The organism can produce antibodies against structures it has never encountered before. Not just against known viruses and bacteria, against any possible chemical structure, including compounds that don't exist in nature. The human genome doesn't have room to individually encode every possible antibody. Instead, the immune system uses a mechanism of random genetic recombination in B lymphocytes to generate a diversity of receptors estimated at more than 10 billion different variants. Each B lymphocyte produced has a unique receptor, randomly generated. The vast majority will never encounter the antigen they were programmed for. But when a lymphocyte finds its corresponding antigen, it rapidly multiplies, clonal expansion, and produces large quantities of the specific antibody. It's a strategy of anticipatory diversity. The body prepares solutions for problems that don't yet exist. A bet on variety as protection against any future threat. Vaccines work in a way that is, when you see the mechanism, elegant. They present to the immune system a harmless version of a pathogen, or a part of it, or simply the instructions to produce a part of it, so that the system mounts a complete adaptive response without the disease occurring. At the end of that process, memory cells remain circulating in the organism. When the real pathogen appears, those memory cells allow a much faster and more intense response than a primary response would be capable of. The system already knows the enemy. It can neutralize it before it causes significant damage. mRNA vaccines introduced a variation of that logic. Instead of presenting the protein directly, they provide instructions for the body's own cells to produce it temporarily, triggering the immune response. The platform wasn't new. There were decades of prior research, but its large-scale application demonstrated something that was previously theoretical. The body can be instructed to temporarily build the key that the immune system needs to learn to recognize a threat. The immune system learns not to attack its own body, and that learning begins before birth. In the thymus, an organ in the chest where T lymphocytes mature, cells that react strongly against the organism's own proteins are identified and eliminated. It's a process of negative selection. The students who fail the test are discarded before they graduate. But the mechanism isn't perfect. Some self-reactive cells escape. Under normal conditions, other regulatory mechanisms keep them under control. When those controls fail, the immune system begins attacking the body's own healthy tissues. More than 80 autoimmune diseases are known. Rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, multiple sclerosis, type 1 diabetes. And the prevalence of these conditions has been increasing in recent decades, possibly related to changes in the microbiome, in diet, and in reduced exposure to certain microorganisms during childhood. The immune system that evolved to handle a specific environment has encountered a radically different one, and sometimes the adaptation isn't perfect. This shouldn't work the way it does, but it does. The intestine houses about 70% of the body's immune cells. Not the blood. Not the spleen. The intestine. That makes sense when you consider what the intestine is: the largest surface of contact between the organism and the external environment. Continuously exposed to food, microorganisms, toxins, and compounds of unknown origin. Maintaining immune surveillance at that interface is a task of enormous scale. The particular challenge of that system is tolerating the trillions of beneficial bacteria of the microbiome while remaining alert to real pathogens. It's a distinction the immune system needs to make continuously, at every moment, based on signals we don't yet fully understand. When that balance is disrupted, the consequences can affect not just the intestine, but the systemic immune system, and, through the vagus nerve and compounds circulating in the blood, the central nervous system itself. And there's one detail about immune memory that resonates in a particular way. After an infection or vaccination, a portion of the lymphocytes that participated in the response differentiates into long-lasting memory cells. These cells persist for years, decades, or sometimes an entire lifetime. Studies conducted with survivors of the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic showed that, decades later, those individuals still possessed functional antibodies against the virus. More recent research identified memory T cells against the virus responsible for a 2003 outbreak still present in patients 17 years after the infection. The immune system holds onto what it has learned. Silently, without conscious effort, a part of every battle the organism has ever won remains present, ready to be called upon again if necessary. A memory that isn't in the brain, but that is just as real as any other. The human sense of smell is more sophisticated than was long believed. For decades, the standard estimate for human olfactory capacity was around 10,000 distinct odors, a number that suggested a modest system compared to other mammals. In 2014, researchers radically revised that estimate, concluding that humans can discriminate more than 1 trillion different olfactory mixtures. The olfactory system has about 400 types of functional receptors. Each odor activates a unique pattern of receptors, and the brain interprets those combined patterns. Sensitivity varies enormously between people, influenced by genetics, age, hormonal state, and experience. Some people can detect certain substances at concentrations of parts per trillion. And that has implications that go beyond the ability to appreciate perfumes. Researchers are documenting cases of people with exceptionally sharp smell who report detecting the odor of certain diseases, including Parkinson's and some bacterial infections, before any clinical diagnosis. The body communicates its internal state in ways we are only beginning to understand. The human body has the capacity to run long distances that surpasses practically any other animal. And that capacity was built by specific adaptations. Humans aren't the fastest. At top speed, we lose to cheetahs, horses, antelopes. But over long distances, in the heat, the story changes completely. The ability to sweat across the entire body surface, something rare among mammals, allows the human body to dissipate heat far more efficiently than most four-legged animals, which cool down primarily through panting. No quadruped sweats with the efficiency of a human. Beyond sweating, there are long elastic Achilles tendons that store and release energy with each stride, large gluteal muscles that stabilize the trunk during running, and other anatomical refinements that make the human runner an endurance machine. The hypothesis is that human ancestors hunted by pursuing prey at a moderate pace for hours, under the sun, until the animals overheated and collapsed. A hunt that depended not on speed, but on thermal persistence. And the body leaves traces of itself on everything it touches. Each person deposits a unique combination of molecules, coming from sweat, skin, and the microbiome, on surfaces, objects, and the air around them. That trace includes proteins, peptids, lipids, DNA fragments, and volatile compounds produced by the skin's bacteria. The composition of that trace is sufficiently unique to identify individuals. Trained dogs can distinguish the scent of identical twins with high accuracy, despite the DNA being practically the same. The molecular traces differ enough to be recognized. Researchers are developing techniques for molecular analysis of traces left on touched objects that can reveal not just identity, but information about diet, health status, and medication use. The human body continuously communicates information about its internal state through channels that everyday perception rarely registers. You are, right now, emitting a chemical signature that is specifically yours. The brain never stops changing with use. That has a name: neuroplasticity. For a long time, neuroscience operated under the idea that the adult brain was a fixed structure. Dead neurons weren't replaced. Connections established in childhood remain stable forever. That view was progressively abandoned. The brain reorganizes connections, strengthens or weakens synapses, and in some regions generates new neurons in response to experience, across an entire lifetime. The hippocampus of London taxi drivers, who need to memorize an extraordinarily complex map, is on average larger than that of non-taxi drivers. Regular meditation is associated with measurable changes in cortical thickness in regions linked to attention and emotional regulation. Professional musicians have visible structural changes in the motor and auditory regions of the brain. The brain physically modifies itself as it's used. Not just functionally, structurally. And that capacity doesn't completely disappear with age. It diminishes, but it remains. The brain you have right now is the result of everything you've ever done, learned, and experienced. And there's something about the circadian rhythm that many people don't know. If a person were isolated from any indication of time, no sunlight, no clock, no external information, their body would continue following a cycle of approximately 24 hours. The internal biological clock doesn't need external cues to function. But it uses light as its primary calibration signal. The molecular mechanism of that clock was discovered in detail over the last few decades and earned the Nobel Prize in Physiology in 2017. It operates inside virtually every cell in the body, not just in the brain, through a set of genes that activate and inhibit each other in a cycle of approximately 24 hours. When that system is disrupted, by night shift work, jet lag, or exposure to intense artificial light in the hours before sleep, the consequences go far beyond tiredness. Metabolism, the immune system, hormonal regulation, and cognitive function are all affected. The circadian rhythm isn't just about when you feel sleepy. It's the temporal structure of all biological functioning. Human DNA shares sequences with virtually every living organism on the planet. Humans share approximately 99% of their DNA with chimpanzees. About 85% with mice, 60% with fruit flies, approximately 31% with yeast, and even about 7% with certain bacteria. That gradation reflects evolutionary distance. The more distant the common ancestor, the smaller the overlap. But what's revealing isn't the total percentage, it's which genes are shared. the genes most conserved across very distant species are the ones that control fundamental processes, the DNA replication machinery, protein synthesis, basic energy metabolism. These mechanisms were so successful over billions of years that evolution kept them virtually unchanged. The human body is built on a biochemical foundation shared with most life on the planet. What distinguishes us is a relatively thin layer of modifications on top of that universal base, the same code used in countless variations, refined over more than 3 billion years. And this is where things get strange in a beautiful way. The human genome isn't just human code. About 8% of the total DNA consists of fragments from ancient viruses that, over millions of years, integrated their genetic material into the genome of human ancestors and stayed there. These endogenous viral elements aren't just passive remnants. Some have been co-opted by the organism for its own biological functions. The formation of the placenta, for example, depends on a protein encoded by a gene of viral origin. The fusion of the cells that form the outer layer of the placenta, allowing the exchange of nutrients between mother and fetus, uses a mechanism that was originally developed by viruses to fuse their membranes with those of the cells they were infecting. The human body used the code of a parasite to create one of the structures most essential to reproduction. It's one example, among many, of how evolution doesn't design from scratch, it modifies, reuses, and transforms whatever it finds available. Human memory is not an archive. The metaphor of the brain as a computer that stores memories in fixed locations is inaccurate in a fundamental way. Every time a memory is recalled, it goes through a process called reconsolidation. It's reactivated, potentially modified by information present in that moment, and then restored. This means memories can change subtly every time they're remembered. Experimental studies have demonstrated that it's possible to implant false memories in people through suggestion, and that those memories are experienced as completely real, with the same conviction as genuine ones. Researcher Elizabeth Loftus extensively documented how eyewitness testimony is influenced by questions asked after the event, altering what the person believes they saw. Memory is a reconstructive and dynamic process, useful for adapting the past to the present, for extracting patterns and meaning from experience. But that same flexibility that makes it useful also makes it susceptible to distortion. The past we remember isn't a recording. It's a reconstruction, shaped by who we are now, in the moment we remember. The human body has a second brain-cleaning system that only works efficiently during sleep. The glymphatic system, identified in detail only in 2013, is a network of channels around the brain's blood vessels that removes metabolic waste accumulated during neural activity. During deep sleep, the space between brain cells increases by up to 60%, allowing cerebrospinal fluid to circulate more freely. Among the compounds removed by this system are beta-amyloid and tau proteins, whose accumulation over years is associated with the development of Alzheimer's disease. Chronic sleep deprivation, therefore, doesn't just compromise immediate cognitive functions. It can result in the progressive buildup of waste that, over decades, contributes to the development of neurodegenerative diseases. Sleep isn't just rest. It's maintenance. It's the window of time in which the brain does the cleaning it can't do while it's awake. Physical touch has measurable physiological effects that go far beyond emotional comfort. Physical contact, hugs, gentle touch, massage, activate specific mechanoreceptors in the skin that send signals to the central nervous system with documented effects. Gentle touch stimulates the release of oxytocin, reduces cortisol levels, lowers heart rate and blood pressure, and activates the parasympathetic nervous system. Studies with premature babies showed that skin-to-skin contact accelerates weight gain, stabilizes body temperature and heart rate, and measurably reduces mortality. In adults, deprivation of physical touch is associated with higher stress levels and poorer emotional regulation. Touch activates a specific neural pathway, see tactile fibers, that is distinct from the fibers that transmit pressure and pain, suggesting that the nervous system evolved with a dedicated pathway for processing social contact. Human touch, in biological terms, is a need with its own neural substrate, not a luxury. And consciousness. The brain processes information, generates behavior, stores memories, and regulates the body. All of that is reasonably well understood. What isn't explained is why all that activity is accompanied by subjective experience. Why is there something it feels like to see red? Why is there something it feels like to be in pain, or to hear music, or to have a thought? That gap between measurable physical processes and subjective experience is called the hard problem of consciousness. And it remains genuinely open. Theories exist. None has been confirmed. What is clear is that consciousness doesn't reside in one specific region of the brain. It seems to emerge from patterns of activity distributed across multiple regions. How organized matter produces subjective experience, how neurons firing create the feeling of being, remains the deepest question neuroscience faces. And perhaps the fact that the question is being asked at all, that there is an experience wondering about itself, is in itself one of the most extraordinary things the universe has ever produced. The human body in space transforms in ways that still surprise researchers. Without the need to bear weight, muscles and bones lose mass rapidly. The heart, which no longer needs to pump blood against gravity, becomes more spherical and reduces its volume. Body fluids redistribute toward the upper body, causing facial swelling and increasing intracranial pressure. That elevated pressure can compress the optic nerve and alter the shape of the eyeball, causing vision problems that in some cases persist after returning to Earth. The gut microbiome changes in composition in microgravity. The immune system shows functional changes. After long missions, returning to gravity is a readaptation process that can take months. The human body was shaped by billions of years of evolution on a planet with constant gravity. In its absence, the systems developed for that specific environment begin to de-adapt within a matter of weeks. We are, in a very literal sense, creatures of Earth's gravitational field. Aging doesn't begin in old age. Some processes of decline start around the age of 25. Bone density peaks around 25 to 30 years of age and begins to gradually decline from there. Cognitive processing speed starts to decrease as early as the third decade of life. Telomeres, structures that protect the ends of chromosomes and shorten with each cell division, begin to wear down from birth. When telomeres become too short, cells stop dividing or enter senescence, a state in which they don't die, but also don't function normally, and secrete inflammatory substances that damage neighboring tissues. The rate of telomere shortening is influenced by chronic stress, smoking, sedentary behavior, and inadequate sleep. Behaviors like regular exercise, adequate sleep, and stress management are associated with longer telomeres. The speed of biological aging isn't a completely fixed destiny. It's partially modifiable by how one lives. And the body never completely stops developing. The hippocampus continues producing new neurons in adult life, though in far smaller quantities than during development. The skin, the intestinal lining, and blood cells renew themselves throughout an entire lifetime. The epigenome, the set of chemical markers that regulate which genes are activated or silenced, continues to be modified by experiences, diet, environment, and behavior over decades. These modifications are influenced by everything that happens, and can alter the functioning of genes without changing the DNA sequence itself. The adult body is not a static structure that simply wears down. It's a dynamic system that continues responding, adapting, modifying itself. That learns from the environment and registers that learning in its own chemistry. That, until the very end, remains in process. And finally, there's something that perhaps summarizes better than anything else what it means to have a body. The boundary between what is the body and what is the environment is biologically far less clear than it seems. The intestine, despite being inside the body, is technically an extension of the external environment. Its contents have never crossed any cell membrane. The lungs are in constant contact with outside air. The skin hosts an ecosystem of microorganisms that influences physiology. Environmental molecules cross membranes and alter gene expression. Viruses integrate their genetic material into DNA and become part of the genome. External experiences physically reshape brain architecture. The human body is not a closed and bounded system. It's a permeable and dynamic interface between what we call self and what we call world. a boundary in constant negotiation, constantly crossed in both directions, constantly redefined by the interaction between the organism and everything that surrounds it. Where exactly you end and everything else begins is a question that biology, the further it advances, is less and less able to answer with precision. And perhaps that's comforting, in a way. You are not an island. You are a conversation. A conversation that began about 3.8 billion years ago, with the first single-celled organisms that learned to copy themselves, to protect themselves, to respond to their environment. A conversation that passed through countless forms, countless adaptations, countless extinctions and emergencies, until arriving here. Every structure in your body carries the memory of that history. The genetic code that allows DNA to be read is practically universal among all living things, a legacy from the very origins of life. The mitochondria that generate energy in your cells are descendants of bacteria that were engulfed by ancestral cells about 1.5 billion years ago in a fusion that was never undone. Evolution didn't stop with the emergence of our species. Genomic studies have identified signals of positive selection in the last tens of thousands of years, genes that spread rapidly through the population related to tolerance of certain foods, resistance to certain diseases, and adaptation to specific environments. The body you inhabit is a work in progress with 3.8 billion years of accumulated history. Not a finished product. A stage in a process that continues. And now, as you rest, all of those processes continue. The heart beats. The kidneys filter. Cells renew themselves. The glymphatic system removes the waste of the day. Memory consolidates what was learned. Hormones orchestrate the transition into deep sleep. You don't need to do anything. The body knows what to do. It learned over billions of years. And that wisdom is available right now, as you rest, as you let the weight of the day be carried by this extraordinary structure that evolved for exactly this, to sustain you, to heal you, to carry you through to tomorrow. Let the body do its work. And as you drift into a deep and restorative sleep, remember to subscribe, so these stories can keep finding you, night after night. Sleep well, and sweet dreams.